As an emergency room physician at St. Vincent's Hospital in Seattle, I had seen my share of injuries over the years, but something about this particular patient caught my attention immediately. His name was Daniel Harper, a 32-year-old software engineer who had been brought in with a deep gash on his left forearm. Dr. Matthew Bennett. I introduced myself, trying to maintain my professional composure despite being struck by his piercing green eyes that seemed to hold an ocean of stories. "What happened here?" I asked as I began examining the wound, noting how he winced slightly while holding his injured arm. "Mountain biking accident," he explained, his voice steady despite the obvious pain. "Lost control on a tricky descent. The cut was severe, requiring multiple sutures, but fortunately hadn't damaged any major blood vessels." As I carefully cleaned the wound, I couldn't help but notice his athletic build, clearly someone who spent considerable time outdoors. "You'll need about 15 stitches," I informed him, preparing the local anesthetic. "I'll numb the area first." He nodded, offering a small smile that somehow managed to make my pulse quicken. While working on his arm, we naturally fell into conversation. Daniel revealed he was an avid outdoor enthusiast, spending most weekends exploring the Pacific Northwest trails and mountains. His passion for adventure was evident in the way his eyes sparkled when describing his latest excursions. "You must think I'm reckless," he chuckled, referring to his injury. I shook my head, carefully threading the needle. "Not at all. Actually, I admire it. Most of my excitement comes from dealing with other people's adventures." He met my gaze for a moment longer than necessary, a thoughtful expression crossing his face. "Maybe you need some adventure of your own," he suggested softly. Finishing the last stitch, I tried to ignore the unexpected warmth spreading through my chest. "All done. You'll need to return in 10 days to have these removed." There was a brief pause before he asked, "Same doctor?" I detected a hint of hope in his voice that made my response come out perhaps too quickly. "I'll be here." Over the next 10 days, I found myself thinking about Daniel more often than I cared to admit. I told myself it was just professional concern, but deep down, I knew there was more to it. When he returned for his follow-up appointment, he looked even better than I remembered. The wound had healed nicely, leaving only a faint line. "Looks like you did excellent work, Dr. Bennett," he commented as I examined the healing tissue. "Matthew," I corrected suddenly. "You can call me Matthew." He smiled, and the simple act of exchanging first names felt like crossing an invisible threshold. "Then you should call me Daniel." As I carefully removed the stitches, our conversation flowed easily. He shared stories of growing up in Oregon, his love for the outdoors developing early during family camping trips. In turn, I spoke about my journey through medical school and my decision to specialize in emergency medicine. "You know," he said as I finished, "I'm leading a beginner's mountain biking group this weekend. Nothing too strenuous. You should join us." I hesitated, aware of the professional boundaries between doctors and patients. But technically, our doctor-patient relationship was concluding with the removal of those stitches. "I'd like that," I heard myself say, surprising even myself. He wrote down his number and the details for the ride, and as he left, he turned back with a smile. "Looking forward to seeing you outside these hospital walls, Matthew." That night, sleep eluded me as I thought about those green eyes and the invitation they carried. It had been 3 years since my last relationship ended, and I'd buried myself in work ever since. Maybe it was time to take a chance on something new, on someone new. A new path forward. The designated trailhead was located about 40 minutes north of the city, nestled in the foothills of the Cascade Mountains. When I arrived that Saturday morning, Daniel was already there, organizing a small group of cyclists. He brightened noticeably when he spotted me, walking over in his biking gear, fitted jersey, padded shorts, and sturdy shoes that somehow made him look even more attractive than in the hospital setting. "You made it," he greeted me, his smile genuine and welcoming. "Couldn't pass up the chance for some fresh air and exercise," I replied, trying to sound casual despite the butterflies in my stomach. The trail wound through dense forests, alongside bubbling streams, and offered breathtaking views of the surrounding mountains. Daniel proved to be an excellent guide, pointing out interesting flora and fauna while ensuring everyone maintained a comfortable pace. What struck me most was how often he found reasons to ride beside me, our wheels occasionally brushing against each other on narrow paths. During one such moment, he leaned closer and said quietly, "So, Dr. Bennett, is this adventurous enough for you?" I smiled, noting how he was being particularly careful with his recently healed arm. "Getting there," I admitted, "though I notice you're being extra cautious with that arm." He laughed, a rich sound that echoed through the forest. "Well, I have a reputation to maintain. Can't keep showing up in your ER. That would be terribly inconvenient, wouldn't it?" Our eyes met, and something electric passed between us, broken only by another rider asking Daniel about the trail ahead. After the ride, as the group dispersed, Daniel approached me at my car. "There's a nice cafe in town," he suggested, "if you're not in a rush." We ended up spending nearly 3 hours in that cafe, talking about everything and nothing. I learned that he'd come out to his parents in college, that his younger brother was his closest confidant, and that he'd traveled extensively throughout Asia. In turn, I shared stories about growing up in Chicago, my decision to become a doctor, and how my previous relationship had ended due to my partner's inability to handle my unpredictable schedule. "It takes a special kind of person to understand the demands of being a doctor," Daniel said thoughtfully. "The late nights, the emergencies, the emotional toll." He shook his head. "Speaking from experience, I don't know how you do it." His directness took my breath away. "Daniel, I know there are complications," he continued, choosing his words carefully. "The whole doctor-patient thing. But technically, I'm not your patient anymore. And I'd really like to take you to dinner." I should have hesitated longer, should have considered the potential complications, the hospital gossip, the professional implications. Instead, I found myself saying, "I'd like that too." Our first official date was the following Friday. Daniel picked me up after my shift, and I was grateful I'd had time to change out of my scrubs. He took me to a cozy French bistro tucked away in a quiet neighborhood. I wanted somewhere we could talk without worrying about running into anyone from the hospital, he explained as we were seated. The consideration touched me deeply. Over wine and cocoa vin, we delved deeper into each other's lives. Daniel told me about his first serious biking accident at 21, an incident that had nearly scared him away from the sport altogether. "What made you go back?" I asked, genuinely curious. "The realization that fear shouldn't stop you from pursuing what you love," he replied, his eyes holding mine. "Sometimes the best things in life require taking risks." Later, as he walked me to my door, there was a moment of delicious tension, that uncertainty before a first kiss. Then Daniel stepped closer, his hand gently cupping my face. "I've wanted to do this since you first stitched up my arm," he murmured before pressing his lips to mine. The kiss was perfect, soft yet filled with promise, tentative yet sure. When we finally pulled apart, we were both breathless. "Would it be too forward to ask you out again tomorrow?" he asked, his forehead resting against mine. "I have the night shift," I regretfully informed him. "Lunch then, before your shift," I suggested, pulling him in for another kiss. "Lunch sounds perfect," he agreed with a smile that lingered in my mind long after he left. Building a life together. The weeks that followed became a delicate dance of stolen moments between my hospital shifts and Daniel's demanding schedule as a software engineer and cycling guide. We discovered a rhythm that worked for us. Lunch dates in the hospital cafeteria when our schedules aligned, quick coffee meetings between his tours, and proper dates whenever fate allowed. Each encounter left me feeling more certain that this was something extraordinary, something worth fighting for. One particularly memorable evening stands out vividly in my memory. After a grueling 12-hour shift dealing with a major car accident, I emerged from the hospital to find Daniel waiting outside with takeout from my favorite Thai restaurant. "You looked exhausted in your last text," he explained simply, handing me the warm bag. We ended up on my couch, me still in my scrubs, sharing pad thai and recounting our respective days. As I described the difficult decisions I'd had to make during the accident victim's treatment, Daniel listened intently, his hand moving soothingly through my hair. "How do you do it?" he asked softly. "How do you handle having people's lives in your hands?" I leaned into his touch, considering his question. Honestly, some days are harder than others. Today was rough. We lost one of the patients. Without a word, Daniel pulled me closer, letting me rest my head on his chest. The steady beat of his heart was comforting in ways I hadn't realized I needed. "You know what amazes me about you," he said after a while. "Your capacity to care, even after everything you see. You still care so deeply." I looked up at him, touched by his understanding. The kiss that followed was different from our previous ones, deeper, more intense, filled with emotion and need. "Stay," I whispered against his lips. His eyes searched mine, seeking confirmation. "Are you sure?" In response, I stood up, taking his hand and leading him to my bedroom. That night marked a new chapter in our relationship. Daniel's touches were both gentle and passionate, his kisses alternating between tender and demanding. Afterwards, lying in his arms, I felt more content than I had in years. "I think I'm falling for you," I admitted softly. He kissed my temple, his voice filled with certainty. "I think I fell for you the moment you started stitching up my arm." The next morning, waking up to find Daniel still there, watching me with those incredible green eyes, felt surreal. "Good morning, Dr. Bennett." He smiled, pressing a kiss to my shoulder. "Good morning, Mr. Harper," I replied, pulling him closer for a proper kiss. We started spending more and more time together. Daniel began keeping some clothes at my place, and I found myself looking forward to coming home to find him there, usually cooking something delicious or working on his cycling routes at my kitchen table. However, our relationship wasn't without its challenges. My unpredictable schedule meant canceled dates and interrupted moments. There were nights when I'd get called into emergency surgery just as we were settling in for dinner, or mornings when my pager would go off before dawn. But Daniel never complained. Instead, he adapted. He'd pack up our interrupted dinners and bring them to the hospital for me to eat between patients. He'd leave encouraging notes in my scrub pockets when I had particularly difficult cases. He was always there with understanding and support. One night, after a successful but complicated surgery that had kept me at the hospital for nearly 20 hours, I came home to find Daniel asleep on my couch, medical journals spread around him. "What's all this?" I asked, waking him gently. He blinked sleepily. "I was reading up on trauma surgery. I wanted to understand more about what you do." In that moment, my heart swelled with emotion. This man who spent his days coding complex software systems and leading cycling adventures had spent his evenings studying medical texts just to better understand my world. "I love you," I blurted out, the words escaping before I could think better of them. His face broke into a brilliant smile. "I love you too, Matthew. So much." As our relationship deepened, we faced new challenges. The hospital grapevine had finally caught wind of our connection, and while most of my colleagues were supportive, there were some who questioned the appropriateness of dating a former patient. Dr. Rachel Thompson, my closest friend in the ER, pulled me aside one day. "Matthew, you know I support you, but be careful. Dr. Harrison has been asking questions about how you met." Dr. Harrison was the head of the ER department, known for his traditional views. The next day, I found myself called into his office. "Dr. Bennett," he began, his expression stern, "I understand you're dating a former patient." "Yes, sir," I replied, keeping my voice steady. "Daniel Harper. He was treated for a laceration, and our relationship began after his treatment was completed." He studied me for a long moment. "You're one of our best trauma surgeons, Matthew. I'd hate to see your judgment questioned." "With all due respect, sir," I responded firmly, "my personal life has never affected my professional performance, and it never will." After a tense discussion, he finally nodded. "See that it stays that way." That evening, I told Daniel about the meeting. We were at his apartment, making dinner together, or rather, he was teaching me how to make his grandmother's lasagna recipe. Maybe we should be more discreet, he suggested, concern evident in his voice. I put down the cheese I was grating and turned to face him. No, I'm not hiding what we have. As long as we're professional about it, they can't do anything. He smiled, pulling me close. Have I told you how sexy you are when you're assertive? The lasagna was slightly overcooked that night, but neither of us minded. Our different careers continued to present challenges. Daniel's guiding work often took him away for days at a time, leading expeditions into remote areas with no cell service. Meanwhile, my erratic hospital schedule meant I sometimes wouldn't see him for days, even when he was in town. One particularly difficult period came when Daniel landed a prestigious guiding opportunity, a month-long expedition in the Canadian Rockies. It was an amazing opportunity for his career, but the timing coincided with a crucial period at the hospital as we prepared for a major trauma center certification. The night before he left, we lay in bed, my head on his chest as he played with my hair. "I'm going to miss this," he murmured. "The bed," I teased. "You idiot," he laughed, then grew serious. "I've never felt this way about anyone before. Being away from you for a month." I propped myself up to look at him. "We'll make it work. You'll be amazing on this expedition, and I'll be here when you get back. Promise." "Promise," he confirmed. During his absence, we communicated through satellite phone when possible and wrote old-fashioned letters that would be delivered whenever his group reached designated checkpoints. His letters were beautiful, describing the landscapes he encountered and how each sunset made him think of me. I threw myself into work, taking extra shifts to keep busy, but every time a cycling accident came into the ER, my heart would stop until I confirmed it wasn't from his expedition group. The night he returned, I was in surgery, deep into a complicated procedure when he got home. He came straight to the hospital, waiting in my office until I finished. When I finally walked in at 3 a.m., exhausted but successful, finding him there felt like coming home. "Welcome back," I said softly. He crossed the room in 3 strides, pulling me into a passionate kiss. "God, I missed you." We barely made it back to my apartment, unable to keep our hands off each other. That night, our lovemaking was intense and emotional, a month of separation fueling our desire. Afterwards, as we lay tangled in the sheets, Daniel traced the tired lines around my eyes. "You look exhausted. Have you been taking care of yourself?" I hadn't really. The combination of extra shifts and missing him had left me running on coffee and determination. "I'm better now that you're here," I said honestly. He kissed my forehead, then surprised me with a question that would change everything. "Move in with me." I blinked, startled. "What?" "Or I'll move in here. I don't care which. I want to come home to you every night I'm in town. I want to take care of you when you're exhausted from saving lives. I want this, us, all the time." The decision to move in together wasn't taken lightly. We spent weeks discussing logistics. His apartment was closer to the cycling centers where he often taught, but mine was walking distance to the hospital. In the end, we chose my place, with Daniel converting the spare room into a home office where he could plan his expeditions. Moving day was chaotic but fun. Daniel's younger brother Ethan came to help, and watching them bicker good-naturedly over where to place furniture reminded me of how much I'd come to love his family. They'd welcomed me warmly from the start, his mother particularly pleased that her adventure-loving son was dating a doctor. "Just promise me you'll keep him safe," she'd said during our first meeting. "Mom," Daniel had groaned, "I'm pretty sure Matthew has seen enough cycling injuries to want to keep me safe anyway." As we settled into living together, we developed our own rhythm. Daniel would wake early to go cycling or prepare for his tours, always making enough coffee for when I got up. I'd come home from night shifts to find breakfast waiting, even if he had to leave it in the fridge with a loving note. About 3 months after moving in together, I woke to find Daniel sitting on the edge of our bed, looking troubled. "What's wrong?" I asked, instantly alert. He handed me his phone, showing an email. It was an offer to lead a 6-month expedition in Patagonia, a dream opportunity for any cycling guide. "This is amazing," I said, even as my heart clenched at the thought of such a long separation. "I'm not going to take it," he said firmly. I sat up. "Daniel, you can't turn this down. It's an incredible opportunity." "I can't leave you for 6 months," he argued. I cupped his face in my hands. "Listen to me. This is your dream. We'll figure it out. We can do video calls, and maybe I can take some time off to visit halfway through." He leaned into my touch. "You do that? Take time off for me." The smile that lit up his face was worth any sacrifice. We spent the rest of the morning planning how we'd manage the separation, and by the time he had to leave for work, he was excited about the opportunity again. That evening, I was in the ER when a severe trauma case came in, a young cyclist who'd crashed during a race. As I worked to save the patient's life, I couldn't help but think of Daniel, of how this could be him someday. The surgery was successful, but it left me shaken. When I got home, Daniel was waiting up, sensing something was wrong from my brief text earlier. "Want to talk about it?" he asked, pulling me into his arms. I told him about the patient, about my fears. "Sometimes I think about getting a call that you're being brought into my ER," I confessed. Daniel interrupted gently. "I can't promise nothing will ever happen to me, but I can promise that I'm always careful, always focused. And having you in my life gives me one more reason to come home safe." We made love that night with an intensity born of fear and reassurance. Each touch a promise, each kiss a declaration of love. The next few months were a whirlwind of preparation for Daniel's Patagonia expedition. I threw myself into research about the area he'd be in, learning about the medical facilities nearby, making sure he had all the necessary vaccinations and medications. 2 weeks before his departure, I surprised him with a romantic weekend getaway to a mountain cabin. As we sat on the deck watching the sunset, sharing a bottle of wine, Daniel turned to me with a serious expression. "I've been thinking," he said, taking my hand. "When I get back from Patagonia, would you consider making this official?" My heart stopped. "Are you asking what I think you're asking?" He smiled nervously. "Maybe. I mean, I know we can't legally get married in every state yet, but we could have a ceremony. I want to commit to you, Matthew. I want everyone to know that you're my person, my family." Tears welled up in my eyes as I looked at the man I loved, silhouetted against the setting sun. "Yes," I whispered. "Yes, I want that too." Daniel pulled me into a kiss that tasted of wine and happiness and promises. We spent the rest of the weekend making plans, not just for a ceremony, but for our future together. We talked about buying a house someday, about the possibility of adopting children, about growing old together. The night before Daniel left for Patagonia was bittersweet. We'd prepared everything. His gear was packed, his itinerary was set, and we had a detailed communication schedule planned out. Still, saying goodbye at the airport was one of the hardest things I'd ever done. 6 months, he reminded me, holding me close. "It'll go by fast. Be safe," I whispered against his neck. "Come back to me. Always." The first month without him was the hardest. I threw myself into work, taking extra shifts to keep busy. Rachel noticed and started forcing me to take breaks, dragging me to the cafeteria for coffee. "You're no good to your patients if you work yourself to exhaustion," she scolded. "I know," I sighed. "I just miss him." She squeezed my hand. "Of course you do, but he'd want you to take care of yourself." Our video calls became the highlight of my weeks. Despite the time difference, we made it work. Daniel would tell me about the magnificent landscapes he was exploring, and I'd share stories from the ER. Sometimes we'd just sit in comfortable silence, working on our respective tasks while simply enjoying each other's virtual presence. 3 months into his trip, I managed to take 2 weeks off to visit him in Patagonia. Watching him in his element, confidently leading groups through some of the most beautiful terrain I'd ever seen, made me fall in love with him all over again. One evening, as we sat by a campfire after his group had gone to sleep, Daniel pulled out a small box. I know we already talked about this, he said, opening it to reveal a simple platinum band. But I wanted to do it properly. My heart raced as he got down on one knee. Matthew Bennett, you make me want to be careful, to come home safe, to build a life that's about more than just the next ride. Will you marry me? You already know the answer. I laughed through tears, pulling him up for a kiss. He slipped the ring onto my finger. I know, but I wanted to see your face when I asked. The rest of my visit passed too quickly, but having the ring on my finger made the remaining 3 months more bearable. It was a constant reminder of what was waiting for me, of the future we were building together. Back at the hospital, my colleagues noticed the ring immediately. Most were supportive, though Dr. Harrison's congratulations seemed somewhat strained. But I found I didn't care any more about others' opinions. What Daniel and I had was real and worth any challenges we might face. I started planning our ceremony during quiet moments at work. Daniel and I would exchange ideas during our calls, both wanting something intimate and meaningful rather than elaborate. We decided on a mountain location, combining our loves, my love for him and his love for the outdoors. The day Daniel was due to return, I was a nervous wreck in the ER. Rachel practically pushed me out the door when my shift ended. Go get your man, she grinned, and tell him he owes me for keeping you sane these past 6 months. I waited at the airport, heart pounding as passengers from his flight began emerging. And then there he was, tanned and slightly thinner, but with that same brilliant smile that had first captured my heart in the ER. He dropped his bags and ran to me, lifting me off my feet in a crushing embrace. God, I missed you. He breathed against my lips before kissing me deeply, not caring about the people around us. That night, as we lay in our bed, bodies entwined, Daniel traced the ring on my finger. 3 months, he said softly. 3 months until I get to call you my husband. I kissed him tenderly. I love you. You know that. I know, he smiled. And I love you too, Dr. Bennett. Even if you did use way too many stitches on my arm that first day. I did not, I protested, laughing. Those stitches were perfectly spaced. He hummed, pulling me closer. Best medical treatment I ever received. As I drifted off to sleep in his arms, I thought about how a simple laceration had led to the greatest love of my life. Sometimes the best things really do come from taking risks, from saying yes to adventure, from allowing yourself to fall in love with a patient who became so much more. A lasting partnership. 3 years have passed since our wedding day, when we exchanged vows on a mountain summit at sunrise, surrounded by our closest family and friends. Daniel wore a suit that somehow still looked perfect despite the hike up, and I managed not to cry too much as we exchanged rings and promises. Life hasn't always been easy. We still deal with long separations when Daniel leads expeditions, and my work at the hospital still means missed dinners and interrupted moments. But we've learned to make it work, to find joy in the small moments, and to strengthen our commitment to each other with every challenge we face. Last year, we bought a house, a beautiful place with mountain views and enough room for the twins we're in the process of adopting. The home office has been converted into a nursery, and Daniel's cycling gear shares space with my medical journals in what we jokingly call our adventure library. He still comes to the ER sometimes, though thankfully not as a patient. He'll bring me dinner during long shifts or just stop by to steal a kiss between his tours and my surgeries. The staff have gotten used to seeing him there, and even Dr. Harrison has warmed up to our relationship, especially after Daniel helped organize a charity cycling event for the hospital's pediatric ward. Every now and then, I'll catch sight of my first set of stitches on his arm, now just a faint silver line, and marvel at how one moment in the ER changed both our lives forever. It reminds me that sometimes the best treatments aren't found in medical textbooks, and that healing comes in many forms. Daniel still teases me about using too many stitches that day, and I still maintain they were perfectly spaced. But we both know that without those stitches, without that moment of connection in a busy ER, we might never have found our way to each other. Last week, as we lay in bed planning our next adventure, a combination medical mission and cycling expedition to Nepal, Daniel turned to me with that same smile that still makes my heart skip a beat. "You know what, Dr. Bennett Harper," he said, using the hyphenated name we'd chosen to share. "I think that arm injury was the best thing that ever happened to me." I couldn't help but agree. Sometimes the most beautiful stories start with a little pain, a few stitches, and the courage to say yes to love. Ours certainly did. Every day, whether I'm in the ER saving lives or at home in Daniel's arms, I'm thankful for that fateful day when a handsome cyclist with a lacerated arm showed me that the greatest adventures aren't always found on mountain peaks. Sometimes they're found in the simple act of falling in love.